TFM.
Welcome, Boomers, to another episode of Warp 5, our dedicated Star Trek Enterprise podcast. I'm Christopher Jones, and with me, as he always is, ready to boldly go, his shirt says today, is my esteemed co-host, Matthew Rushing. And Matthew, I've got great news for you. Perfect timing with football season about to start. Those three house guests we have, they've invited us to a barbecue.
Well, that's fantastic because I love a good barbecue, especially, when I'm watching some fall football. And as long as the beer is good, and the barbecue is good, it almost leaves you thinking, I don't really care who wins the game. But that's not true.
Yeah, well, I do have some bad news for you.
Okay.
One, the barbecue is taking place in a closed space, so there might be a bit of smoke. And also, Captain Archer's iPad, he only has water polo on it, so we're going to have to watch water polo. I hope that doesn't bring the excitement level down too much for you.
Well, I mean, I guess that's okay. If that's all we got, it's better than, movie night. So,
movie night on an iPad stuck to the wall in a
who's picking these movies
space.
anyway? That's what I want to know.
Someone in the licensing department to make sure they can keep the budget down.
I'm sure.
Yes, everyone. Today we are going to visit the Catwalk, the 12th episode of Season 2 of Star Trek Enterprise, as we continue our 20th anniversary rewatch. Here's a quick rundown of the episode. What looks to be an exciting field trip to a life-filled planet is cut short before it begins, when the Enterprise encounters a ship carrying three aliens with an urgent request. A neutronic storm is about to sweep through the system, and they'll die if they don't get out of the area right away. Or so they say. Escape means going to Warp 7, only the Enterprise tops out at Warp 5. What to do? Bunk up in the warp nacelles, of course. The shielding should be enough to keep everyone safe from the radiation for 8 days, Phlox agrees. Plus, it's a great place for a barbecue. But as Mother always said, don't leave the front door unlocked and don't leave your starship unattended, because you never know who might come in while you're away. The Enterprise gets surprise visitors amidst a terrible storm, and a race ensues to take back the ship before the crew gets fried. And it all happens in spacesuits. How exciting does that sound, Matthew?
Well, it is definitely exciting. I love a good spacesuit adventure. And so, but I think this is an episode which is really interesting because, you mentioned this even before we're recording, and there seems to be this bag of tropes that Star Trek has used before to create this specific episode. You've got a space storm and aliens that could possibly take over the ship. You've got aliens who may or may not be telling us the truth. You've got people learning about us through digging through our logs. And
don't forget the classic aliens who are chasing their own people who are wanted for a crime or, in this case,
supposed
desertion.
Crime.
Yeah, something. Right.
So, especially since we don't really know who we're supposed to trust in all of this. So, I think it's really interesting that you had said that, because I honestly, watching the episode, I've never even thought about it in that way, which is maybe strange. And I think, to me, it's because what they do with these tropes is create something that we haven't really seen, which is they're utilizing the fact that this is the first, time in space like this, the first Warp 5 ship, and all of that to create a story that you couldn't actually do really in one of the other series. At least the way it's written here wouldn't make sense at all. And so I feel like they created a really nice why for all of those things to happen. And to me, it's still an episode that I feel like really does hold up, even though a lot of this feels familiar if you think about it, for more than a few minutes.
Right. Yeah. The neutronic storm itself has been used before, or mentioned before anyway, a couple times in Voyager. We've had the episodes where like the whole crew has to go into some kind of stasis, and one person, in the case of Voyager, it was 7, has to see the ship through some kind of space anomaly or something that they, in the same case as here, they can't go around, right? They have to go through it, which is another of those things in Star Trek. I know you could argue that things stretch for too many light years and it's hard to go around, but so often in Star Trek, at least what's visually portrayed is there's this ribbon of something coming towards us, or we're headed towards it, and we can't go up and over it or down and under it. We've got to fly straight through it, right? And so they carried that through right here. As we're recording this, Larry Nemechek, he was headed to Las Vegas for the Star Trek Las Vegas convention, and he tweeted that he's stuck on the highway and the traffic's backing up, and then his delay's getting longer. And I told him, stop thinking in 2 dimensions. Just go over it. But apparently that seriously is not possible on the surface of the Earth.
Yeah, no, it's unfortunately not the case here. Your 3-dimensional thinking won't really help you in that, and until maybe, I guess, we create flying cars, and then it's a whole other mess. But
can you imagine with all the bad drivers what it's going to be like when we're flying everywhere? Oh my gosh!
No, I can't.
I hope those cars come with shields.
Yes, I feel like there's a lot of damaged homes. But that's a whole other podcast. I think
that's our new HGTV podcast we're going to do together. Damaged homes. We're branching out. We're taking this whole expanding the network beyond Star Trek thing to the extreme.
Yes, extreme damaged homes. That's what we're going to call it. You got to put that in there somewhere so people want to watch. But I mean, too, one of the things that I think, again, makes this feel more legitimate is the sense that this storm is big enough, especially for a ship that it can only go warp 5.
Yeah.
If they could go warp 7, these aliens said, they could outrun the storm. And I think one of the ways in which they kind of deal with the trope that you talked about is that because of some quote-unquote fancy flying from Mr. Mayweather, they are actually out of the storm earlier than they thought they were going to be. So there is this idea of like, you can get up or over or around or, all this with the storm, but it takes time, and so I liked that. And then, of course, when you're in the storm, you couldn't go to warp. One, because you're in the nacelles. So that puts a damper on that, really, unless you want deep fried crew for dinner.
Is that on the menu at Bubba Gump Shrimp Company? I was just there last weekend.
I don't think so. I don't know. You'd have to go to Cisco's Creole Kitchen, and see if that's what they're serving up.
Well, you know what?
That actually,
I hear that deep fried crew is extra delicious with some Ketracel white hot sauce on it.
It absolutely is. Just ask Mariner. But I think it's just one of those places where, to me, this has always been a standout episode of Enterprise. And part of it was the way in which they were utilizing the series that as created to then bring in tropes that work when put together in this manner, because it makes more sense where we are in the timeline of Star Trek. And I think that it was just an interestingly crafted episode then because of all of that.
Right. Well, the radiation threat is a key part of that, right? And it's said that the way the story came about is Mike Sussman read an article about how astronauts going to Mars would have to deal with a lot of radiation. And then he thought, well, the Enterprise crew, they probably have to deal with this as well, because this is not the Enterprise D. And even the Enterprise D, you have to deal with radiation threats sometimes, right? It's not like the future starships are purely safe from this kind of stuff. But a ship like the Enterprise probably would have a lot of the same risks that our current spacecraft technology has. It would be better, but it's still going to not be able to withstand something like this storm. And so the idea, and we've seen this in other space films, right? The idea that the crew needs to take shelter in a certain part of the ship that's more heavily shielded to get through solar burst from the sun, a solar flare, radiation burst or something. So that made a lot of sense. And the way they sprinkled the episode with dialogue about how the Vulcans had encountered a storm like this. Travis mentioned that they had encountered a storm not as bad as this one, but they had to be down there for, 6 weeks hiding from the storm. I thought that they presented this in a realistic way that, yeah, these things happen in space. They're not all over the place, but you're going to encounter them from time to time. And if you're in these early days of space travel, you're going to have to figure out how to cope with them. And this was the first experience that humans had with anything like this. And then they have to use their ingenuity to figure out how to try to make it through. And also, T'Pol, we talk about her growing understanding of humans. She knew not to tell them that that Vulcan ship had been completely lost because it might lessen their spirits or their motivation. She kind of knew how to encourage them to find a solution.
Yeah, I definitely think that's a really key point, because it makes me wonder then, because of this moment, do future starships that are built, have more of that type of shielding component on larger portions of the ship? Is it the whole ship that we're going to do that to? Or do we have specific compartments like maybe the shuttle bay or something like that we, use this lining material for, so that if this happens, you have the opportunity then to have a larger area that would be more comfortable for the crew if this kind of thing happens. So, it's kind of something that I wish you might have been revisited in the future with Enterprise. But just alone, like you said, this is a great question that kind of comes from actual things that happen now that you just kind of extrapolate then. And so, thinking about those type of things. I mean, I was just thinking about growing up in the Tornado Alley in the United States. This is a big thing where people would legitimately have storm shelters, right? And you only see those in specific areas of the country because of the type of storms that come where, you have massive twisters you get, that the only way to really stay safe is in a storm shelter that's underground. This is kind of that whole idea. So I love that Enterprise is playing with this idea because, again, where you are in the timeline, where it's easy to create the situation where, we're just not advanced enough to have really done this, to even really have necessarily thought about this until we are smack dab in the middle of it.
Yeah. I have an idea. You notice how nacelles tend to get a bit larger as starship development progresses in Star Trek. Maybe someone decided that instead of putting extra shielding in other areas, let's just make the catwalks a little bit larger. And then, because I live in Tokyo, I came up with this idea. Let's line the walls of the catwalk with little capsule hotel pods. So people can just slide in there like we would in Tokyo in a capsule hotel. And those pods have extra radiation shielding.
All I'm thinking of is that's why the JJ verse.
That's what I'm thinking of.
Timeline nacelles are so big.
That's why the big bulge is there.
Outrageously huge. Yeah, exactly.
It's a capsule
please
hotel.
Don't get me started on how stupid those are. Oh my gosh!
It's a capsule hotel for radiation storms. Yeah.
Yeah, you you had also brought up, this is about the early days of space travel, and this whole thing, I think, is just, Mike Sussman reading that article and then bringing that to Enterprise is, I think, just a perfect example of a lot of the type of stories that Enterprise can do that you can't do in other series.
Mm-hmm.
And this is a story. Yes, I know we've done this kind of like in Voyager with that episode where Seven's kind of by herself that whole episode and everything. But I think that this is what makes it work as well, is that this is a story that continues a thread that's been working throughout the entire first season and now into the second season, which is how this crew comes together. And part of this episode is when you're that close together, in many ways, this episode has more relevance now. So many of us spent 2020 and 2021 in close confines with people, much more than we have in the rest of our lives.
Mm-hmm.
And you start to get on each other's nerves. Tempers start to flare and nerves begin to fray, and the whole that's what part of this episode is about, is dealing with the super close quarters. And is it going to bring the crew together, or is it going to kind of create ripples? And so to me, that's a great thing to kind of put this crew through at this point to see, okay, can they withstand the pressure?
Yeah. I think that for that element of the episode to work as well for me, I have to really remember how long they are in the catwalk, because the compressed nature of the story, because we have 44 minutes to tell the story, it feels like Malcolm and Trip in particular become snappy with each other much more quickly than I would expect them to, as people who are senior officers on the ship, who are trained as Starfleet officers, who are otherwise friends and so forth. But if you remember how much time is actually passing for them, maybe, and I don't remember exactly at that point in the episode how much time had passed. I don't even know if
it's almost like a week. Yeah.
Well, they're in there for 8 days, roughly 8 days. But the moment where they're playing cards and they start getting snappy with each other, I don't know if it's specified how long they've been in there, but let's assume they've been there for 3 or 4 or 5 days, maybe 5 days, then yeah, it makes sense that they would be getting a little bit on edge at that point. And I can see, like, if you're starting to feel stressed like Trip, you're starting to feel a little bit on edge, and you're an engineer and you did your best in 4 hours to prepare this area for everyone, and you've got Malcolm complaining about not having a shower, then yeah, you'd probably get kind of snappy about that, even if it was your best buddy saying it, right?
Yep. Yeah, well, and there's part of that too is you deal with the whole thing that, what is it? You're only 3 meals away from total annihilation or whatever. I think the phrase goes something like that. Bad paraphrase, but you're kind of getting to that point here where it's the same food all the time, and you're losing a lot of the creature comforts, like being able to take a shower, be clean, all of that kind of stuff. There's no space, all of that stuff begins to get on your nerves. And it, again, you create that situation where, okay, is the crew going to find a way to come together, or are they going to find a way to just kind of tear each other apart? And I think what this episode does is it allows them to ride the wave together, like there's going to be some highs and there's going to be some lows in this, but they kind of find a way to, I think, come closer together. And one of the things is, the very end of the episode where T'Pol is watching the movie with the crew because she's got nothing else to do. And, she's following the story where they aren't necessarily. And then Trip invites her to come to movie night, and he would love to see her there. And so you get this whole moment of, it's a character moment between them, but it's a growth moment for T'Pol herself, where she kind of, I think, the way Jolene plays it is so perfect, because she kind of stops, and then she gets that look on her face like, I might actually enjoy going to movie night, you know? And a thing that she probably thought she would never be interested in.
Right.
You know, but now that she's experienced the experience, it is something that speaks to her. And so I just think those are the little moments that happen all throughout this episode with these characters that I think make this a story that is fun, not only to watch, obviously, the first time, but it's a fun episode to just kind of pop in and rewatch because of these things that happen.
Mm-hmm. Maybe she's thinking, I want to go so I can observe the humans and see how long it takes them to figure out the plot that's so obvious. And
Exactly.
why can't they see it? What's happening?
Isn't it like that, though? I mean, have you ever watched a movie with somebody who just, like...
Yeah.
They're asking you questions the whole time, and you're like, are you paying attention at all?
Yeah. Yeah. I did that watching this episode to prepare for this podcast, in fact.
Yeah.
And I finally said, I'm not going to answer your questions during the episode. Just watch and you'll find out. But movie night plays into another element of this story, which is great, which is bringing the crew together. And that's something that Archer tells T'Pol is a positive about the situation, is that it is bringing the crew together. It's something you can do on the NX-01 because the crew is so small compared with the ships that we get later, particularly when we get into like TNG and the Enterprise D. But here, you do have a small crew. Everybody knows each other. And bringing them all into a space like this gives them an opportunity to bond in a difficult situation. And I think that is it's another realistic element to Enterprise. Like we talked about the radiation threat. We talked about how to deal with these unknowns in space. And then also having the crew come together to work more as a team. The standout moment, and this ties into the other point that we have on the outline, which is Archer as a nurturing captain. The moment that always stands out to me in this episode is when the crew member who's doing the crossword puzzle asks Archer for the clue, and the exchange, the way that Scott Bakula delivers his line so gently and with care to someone who is an ensign or a crew member. I have to go back and check to be sure. But her expression too, the way that she played it, of being kind of in awe that the captain is taking the time to be so kind to her and to answer her question. All of this, I think, highlights how this episode shows the reality of a small crew like this at this point in space exploration.
Yeah, I do. I love that scene because it tells us so much about Archer as a person. And even though it's a small crew, and he, probably knows everybody's name, it doesn't mean that he interacts with them on a daily basis. And so this really puts everybody in a situation where you are interacting with everybody that you might not normally interact with. I mean, there is still a lower decks on Enterprise. And so I really did like that scene. And absolutely, I think, the interaction that this person has had with the captain has been probably so minor, if any at all. I think there is that moment where you're like, oh, the captain is talking to me. And so, but I just think it shows his willingness to be the leader that they all need, and to put himself in their position. And, all of them, many of them are probably scared as to what might happen, because this is an unknown situation. They truly are going where no one has gone before in this, except for what we learned from T'Pol, where the ship was destroyed. And so, it would be kind of a terrifying situation, much like being in a storm shelter when a massive F5 tornado is going over you, you know? And so, you know, I think that that's such a beautiful moment. At the same time, you know, you also get the moment where Archer is slightly annoyed at T'Pol, and T'Pol is slightly annoyed at him. And so you kind of even see that, you know, where it's like, but their realness with each other leads to them having an interesting conversation, you know? And so it's all of these little nuances that took all of the things that we mentioned at the beginning where, yeah, you could call that a trope, but how you package it and then how you deliver it as an actor makes all the difference. And so to me, this is one of those places where I think the crew and the cast really shine through, because the little moments you get with like Hoshi in the episode with the captain, the little moments that you have with like Travis and him kind of reacting to the way in which the captain praises him to everybody
Giant
on
grin.
the, you know,
Giant Anthony Montgomery
exactly.
grin.
Yep. So I think all of that stuff speaks volumes for a script that in the hands of a lesser cast or even maybe even just a lesser writer here, I think would have, you know, been really different.
Yeah. Yeah, we keep talking almost every episode recently about how T'Pol and Archer are growing closer. And the scene here, I always feel like they're like a married couple in the bed. Am I bothering you? Am I bothering you? Like someone's reading, someone got the phone. There's always something. They're further apart, of course, but it has that feeling to it. And you can tell like the relationship has become a lot closer. They're a lot easier with each other at this point. And the funny thing is that T'Pol doesn't want to say anything because she's bothered by the smell of Porthos. And she doesn't want to say anything, so she stays quiet. But then Archer, he doesn't mind letting her know that, yeah, your little beeping is bothering me. And that's the other question. Why doesn't Starfleet put a silence button on these pads? You know, if that were an iPad, you could just slide the little button and it wouldn't make beeping noises every time you tap something.
She's apparently T'Pol is a person who still has the clicks on their, you know, their keyboard on their iPhone that you're like looking at like, what is wrong with you?
Well, I'll tell you. So Japan, you know, the culture in general is very polite. People are always concerned for the most part about bothering someone else, disturbing someone else. Of course, there are outliers, but overall, people are like that, very considerate of others. And on trains, because we go most places by train here, we don't drive nearly as much as in the U.S., you're not supposed to use your phones on the train, like to have a phone conversation, and you're supposed to silence your devices so it doesn't bother other people. And yet there are always those few people who have the ringer on. And even if they don't, they won't have a phone conversation on the train, but they won't silence the ringer or put it into buzzing mode, right? It's just funny. And so this is kind of the same thing here. T'Pol's one of those people, I guess, who's like, I'm going to leave all the sounds on. Yeah, and you're probably right. She probably does have the clicky keyboard on as well, right? So everything she types is going...
Which is terrifyingly awful. Yeah. So,
but talk about being scared in this storm. That comes through with Hoshi again a little bit, which is something that we talked about a few episodes ago with Hoshi overcoming the fears that she showed in the first season and doing a pretty good job of at least giving the appearance that she's overcome them. But she's understandably nervous in this storm. And it reminded me of, I used to live in Reno, and in Reno, even if it's not at ground level snowing, as you come in over the Sierra Nevadas, it's often snowing up at high altitude, and Reno is in a valley just right. It's like a straight dive off of the mountains, and the airport, you have to descend very quickly to land at the airport in Reno. And I remember I used to come back from business trips and such, and I would be coming in, and the plane. We're descending through a snowstorm, quickly descending, and the plane is just shaking and shaking and shaking, and you feel like, are we going to actually land? Because then you come down the runway and they have to stop quickly as well, so they're slamming on the brakes. It's the scariest airport I've ever had to land in. But anyway, being in a storm like this and thinking about memories of something like that, I can totally put myself into the shoes of these people who were stuck in this small space. They can't move on their own very much and feeling uncertain.
Yeah, I mean, I think the other thing that makes this work is that the production design is phenomenal for the catwalk. And so I think that was something that, and the shot selection of, making things feel claustrophobic by the way that you're shooting the scenes, which is really well done. And so I think that's one of the things that really helps bring you into the episode, which is, that's a really important choice. Like, you need to be doing those things to bring everything together. So it's the writing and the acting and then how you shoot this type of episode that really sets it apart, or it can make it feel like, eh. And I think this one transcends that, right? Because of the choices that they make on every single level, that raises this from just being an okay episode to an episode that I would say is pretty great.
Yeah, I agree. And in that cramped space, there's a little bit, there are humorous moments in here to kind of lighten the mood a little bit. And one of them is the barbecue that the three aliens have. It's funny, but it also reminds me that you do have people like that. I remember my first year in university. At the University of Alabama, I lived in this dorm, a 13-story dorm. It was famous for having false fire alarms, but sometimes they were legitimate, because one time, these guys, you're from the South, so you know exactly what I'm talking about. You know those smokers with the dome on top, and you slow cook the meat with hickory chips, for 10 hours?
It's amazing.
Well, some guys in my building decided to use one in their living room. And they were smoking meat in their living room, and there's smoke pouring out from underneath the door, the crack of the door to the room, and of course the fire alarms go off and all. And I always think of that experience when I watch this episode and these aliens are doing the barbecue in the catwalk.
But great sausage, so.
All right. So last thing to cover before we wrap up here. I find it interesting that we've spent half an hour talking about this episode, and we have never mentioned the aliens that come aboard the ship and that take over the ship, and the firefight in the kitchen to get the ship back, and all the trips around the ship by trip in the spacesuit and so forth. And that's what drives the story, but it really is just there to give us all the other elements, don't you think?
No, I do agree with you on that. And, I think one of the things that if you wanted to make this episode, like, say, I think the perfect episode, I think one thing that you do is it would be nice if you just have it a little bit longer so you could tweak some of that stuff where you really learn who these aliens are on both sides, right? The ones that were harboring unintentionally, and then the ones that are after them, because it does, you get the feeling like they're this militia, so that they are probably extra military organization on their planet possibly, and all this stuff. So you get all of these feelings about them that just come from the words that are used to describe them, and then of course the actions that they're taking. But it does leave you desiring more, I think. And so, I think if anything, that's just one place where this episode could have benefited from, say, how we do streaming now, where, an episode can be 5 minutes longer to allow for that kind of storytelling possibility. I think they absolutely do kind of the best job you can with the time that they're given because of this type of episode and what it is and everything. But I do think, you could absolutely, it could be 10 minutes longer, and you'd just be like, oh, that's great, So,
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I think it's fine for me the way it is because I really feel the point in the episode is everything that we discussed today.
Yeah.
And
Oh, yeah.
these aliens are just here to put the crew in that situation. But I can also see some viewers watching it and feeling shortchanged by, or feeling like these aliens are too generic in their presentation. And, when you're watching for a while, you're thinking, well, how can they be in the storm and they're fine and they're in this little ship and they don't have any problems? And then there's just that one line about, oh, they're immune to the radiation. And then that raises all kinds of questions too. Like, how did they develop immunity to radiation in a neutronic storm that's just floating through space, right? So it's just kind of a quick way to, I think, in the writing to allow that aspect of the story to work, but it leaves you with questions that, if you had 5 or 10 more minutes, maybe you could flesh that out in a way that felt more complete.
Yeah, 100%. No, I 100% agree with you. So,
all right. Well, what are your final thoughts and what's your rating for this one?
I mean, I really like this episode. It's always been a personal favorite of mine from when it first arrived, when it first premiered, and even till now. I think that it is a great episode of Enterprise. I think they do a really good job with it in a way that creates something that helps us to be able to really spend time with these characters and enjoy these characters, know these characters more, and that makes for a lot of fun, in all honesty. So I really appreciate absolutely what they do in the episode. I think it really is fantastic, and I don't really think that there's anything other than what I mentioned about the fact that if you could have possibly made this episode a little bit longer. Other than that, like I think that this episode is just kind of everything you want, and so I think it's great. I love it, and I would give this episode 4.5 out of 5 barbecues.
All right, sounds good. Yeah, I don't have a lot to add to what I've already said. I agree. It's a great episode for the character development for the crew instead of just a few characters at this point, and a great realistic presentation of where we are in the timeline. It's fun that we get to see Chef. It's the only time we see Chef on screen, in fact, and we, of course, only see him from the waist down. And I also love that there's a lot of Porthos in this one. He gets a lot of screen time.
Yeah.
He's one of my favorite parts of Enterprise. So I really love that. I'm going to give this one 8 storage lockers converted into latrines.
Nice.
Which sounds like a bad rating, but it's actually a good one because, you never want to have to go look for a latrine.
You do not.
All right, everyone. We would love to hear your thoughts on the Catwalk. There are many ways for you to share those with us. Of course, the best way is to go to Facebook and join the Babel Conference. That is our listeners group. It's a closed group, so if you're joining for the first time, please answer the questions and agree to the rules of the forum so that I can let you in. Let us know that you heard about it on Warp 5. And to find it, just type Babel, B-A-B-E-L, into the search field. It should come right up. If not, type the Babel Conference, the full name. And if you'd like to send us email, you can do that by going to our website, trek.fm/contact. Use the form you find there, choose to send to a show, and choose Warp 5. And that'll come to Matthew and me by email. And in social media, you can find us everywhere on Instagram, Twitter, everywhere. Our username is TrekFM, and we'd love to hear from you there. And if your podcast app of choice allows you to leave a rating or a review, we would love to get that from you as well. Let us know what you think about the show. Let others know about the show. Help them find our Enterprise rewatch. Now, Matthew, when you're not doing your little turn on the catwalk, you know what I mean, your little turn on the catwalk, where can people find you?
Oh my gosh, Chris, I cannot believe you brought that up. But you can find me all over social media under the name MattRushing02. Of course, Twitter, Instagram, Letterboxd, Vero, all of those types of places there online you can find me. Of course, you can also find me here on the network doing a bunch of shows. One, we have an entire side of the network that's not devoted to Star Trek, and that is called the 602 Club. And yes, of course, we're thinking about adding, disastrous makeovers from alien disasters, or just flying cars. So
damaged houses, HGTV
exactly.
this fall.
Exactly. So, but you can find us talking about all of those franchises that we love that are outside of Star Trek. So just hope that you will check that out. Of course, you can also find me doing literary treks about the books and the comics of Star Trek. Chris, you and I do The Orb, where we talk about Star Trek Deep Space Nine. Then we're over on The Artificial Tango, talking about Star Trek Picard, and Saddle Up, talking about Star Trek Strange New Worlds. And then over on the Nerd Party Network, I do have a couple of shows. One is completed. I did that with Drea Kaufman, and we talked about every single chapter of the Harry Potter series, one chapter at a time. And then over on that network, you'll also find me with John Mills talking about Star Wars each and every week on Aggressive Negotiations. Now, Chris, when you're not trying to find a shower, where can people find you?
Yeah, I'm really upset that Trip didn't think about that. I mean, what was he doing? 4 hours, plenty of time to put in a shower.
Totally inappropriate. Totally inappropriate.
But you can find me elsewhere on the network. As you mentioned, you and I do a lot of shows together, so you can catch me on those. You can find me in many episodes of a lot of shows in the back catalog, including the early years of this show. And also Larry Nemechek and I do The Ready Room from time to time, and we do have a new episode out recently, so check that out. And if you'd like to chat with me, you can find me on Twitter. My username is C. Brian Jones, letter C, and Brian with a Y. That's my username everywhere on social media, but Twitter is where I'm most active, and I'd love to chat with you there. And if you would like to help us keep the network, everything that we've talked about, all these shows going, we could definitely use your help. To find out how to get involved and support the network, visit patreon.com/trekfm. That's patreon.com/trekfm. And we send a huge thank you to everyone who's supporting us right now. We would not be here without you, seriously. So thank you so much for your help. Well, Matthew, I hope you've got your sunscreen ready, because we may sweat a little bit next time as we talk about Dawn.
Well, Chris, I'm always ready for a good suntan, so let's go.